The morning of February 14th, 1943, near Sidi Bou Zid, central Tunisia, North Africa, Capitano Giuseppe Rosselli stood in the turret of his M13 over 40 medium tank, watching American half-tracks and trucks moving across the valley below. His tank company, part of the 131st Armoured Division Centauro, had taken position on the ridgeline before dawn. The German commanders had been explicit in their orders. Italian armour would support the attack on American positions. The Americans were inexperienced, freshly arrived from across the Atlantic. They had never faced real armour warfare. This would be their education. Rosselli felt confident. His crew had fought in Libya since 1941. They had faced British Crusader tanks and survived. They knew their M13 over 40 medium tank thoroughly. It mounted a 47mm gun capable of penetrating 45mm of armour at 500 metres. The frontal armour was 30mm thick on the turret, 25mm on the upper hull. The tank weighed 14 tons and could reach speeds of 32 km per hour on roads. It was not the best tank in the world, but it was adequate. More importantly, it was Italian. It represented years of Italian engineering and industrial effort. The crew trusted it. What Rosselli and his men were about to discover would fundamentally change their understanding of modern armoured warfare. The Americans possessed a capability that Italian tank crews had never encountered, had never trained for, and had barely imagined possible. American tanks could fire their main guns accurately while moving at full speed. Italian tanks could not. No Italian tank could. The revelation would come not through intelligence reports or technical briefings, but through the brutal clarity of combat, where technological advantages manifest as the difference between hitting your target and dying in a burning tank. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching. From today, the Italian armoured forces that deployed to North Africa in 1940 represented the best equipment Italian industry could produce. The M13 over 40 medium tank was the result of several years of development, building on lessons learned from the Spanish Civil War and the invasion of Albania. Italian engineers had designed it as a balanced vehicle, prioritizing reliability and ease of production over maximum armour or firepower. The philosophy was sound for Italy's industrial capacity and strategic situation. Build tanks that could be produced in meaningful numbers, that could be maintained in the field with limited spare parts, and that could perform adequately against expected opponents. The M13 over 40 entered production in 1940 at Fiat Ansaldo facilities in Turin and Genoa. By the time production ended in 1942, Italian factories had built approximately 710 units. This represented a significant industrial achievement for Italy, whose economy was strained by years of military spending, and whose industrial base was smaller and less modernized than those of Britain, Germany, or the Soviet Union. The tank measured 4.92 meters long, 2.28 meters wide, and 2.38 meters tall. A four-man crew operated it. The commander stood in the turret alongside the gunner. The driver and hull machine gunner occupied the forward compartment. The main armament was the 47 over 32 gun, a 47mm weapon with a barrel length of 32 calibers. This gun fired armour-piercing rounds at a muzzle velocity of 630 meters per second. At 500 meters range, it could penetrate approximately 45mm of vertical armour plate. This was adequate for engaging British Crusader tanks with their 30mm armour, and sufficient for most light and medium tanks Italy expected to face in North Africa. The secondary armament included 4 Breda Model 38 machine guns. 2 were coaxially mounted in the turret alongside the main gun. 1 was mounted in the hull, operated by the hull machine gunner. 1 was mounted on the turret roof for anti-aircraft defence, though it was rarely used in that role due to the difficulty of engaging aircraft from a moving tank. The armour protection reflected Italian design priorities. The frontal turret armour was 30mm thick. The upper hull front was 25mm. The lower hull front was 30mm. Side armour varied from 25mm on the upper hull to 25mm on the lower sections. Rear armour was 25 mm. The deck armour was only 14 mm, and the belly armour just 6 mm. This armour scheme provided protection against rifle fire, machine guns, and shell fragments. It could resist smaller anti-tank weapons at longer ranges, but it was vulnerable to dedicated anti-tank guns of 37 mm or larger caliber. The Fiat SPA 15 tons V8 diesel engine produced 125 horsepower at 1,900 revolutions per minute. This gave the 14-ton tank a power-to-weight ratio of approximately 8.9 horsepower per ton, which was modest but adequate for its intended role. Maximum road speed was 32 km per hour, approximately 20 miles per hour. Cross-country speed was significantly less, typically 15 to 18 km per hour depending on terrain. The suspension used a bogie system with 8 road wheels per side arranged in pairs. Leaf springs provided the suspension, a simple and reliable design that was easy to maintain, but provided a rough ride over uneven terrain. The tank carried 104 rounds of 47 mm ammunition stored in racks throughout the fighting compartment. It also carried 3,048 rounds of machine gun ammunition distributed between the turret and hull positions. Fuel capacity was 145 litres, approximately 38 gallons, giving an operational range of about 200 kilometres on roads under ideal conditions. In practice, cross-country operations reduced this significantly. Italian tank crews who deployed to North Africa received training at the armour school in Civitavecchia. The training emphasized mechanical reliability, basic gunnery, and formation tactics. Crews learned to maintain their vehicles under field conditions with limited tools and spare parts. They practiced loading and firing the main gun, though live-fire exercises were limited due to ammunition shortages. They rehearsed radio procedures, though in practice only 1 tank in 3 had a functional radio, leaving most crews dependent on visual signals for coordination. Gunnery training followed established doctrine. The tank would stop. The commander would identify a target and give range and direction to the gunner. The gunner would traverse the turret using the manual hand crank, aim using the telescopic sight, and fire. After firing, the crew would observe the fall of shot, make corrections if necessary, and fire again. This procedure assumed the tank would be stationary during engagement. Moving while firing was considered impossible for accurate shooting. The 47 mm gun had no stabilization. The telescopic sight bounced and shook when the tank was in motion. The suspension transmitted every bump and irregularity directly to the hull and turret. Attempting to aim while moving was futile. Every army trained the same way: stop, aim, fire. Italian tank crews learned this procedure until it became automatic. They practiced it in training. They executed it in combat. It was the only way they knew to fight with their equipment. The assumption was universal. Accurate tank gunnery required a stable firing platform. That meant a stationary tank. Movement and accurate fire were mutually exclusive. You could move, or you could shoot, but you could not do both simultaneously. This assumption was based on mechanical reality. Tanks in the 1930s and early 1940s lacked the technology to stabilize their guns. The gun mount was fixed rigidly to the turret. When the tank moved, the entire vehicle pitched, rolled, and vibrated. The gun moved with it. The sight picture in the gunner's telescope jumped and bounced. Hitting a target while moving was a matter of luck, not skill. Consequently, tank tactics emphasized finding good firing positions, stopping to engage, and moving only when necessary to reposition or avoid enemy fire. Italian armour doctrine reflected this reality. Tanks would advance to contact with the enemy. Upon encountering opposition, they would halt and form a firing line. They would engage enemy positions with direct fire, suppressing infantry and destroying enemy armour. If the enemy retreated, Italian tanks would advance again, moving to the next position. If the enemy counterattacked, Italian tanks would hold their ground and fight from stationary positions where their gunnery would be most effective. This doctrine had worked reasonably well against British forces in Libya during 1940 and 41. Italian M13 over 40 tanks had engaged British Crusader and Matilda tanks in numerous small actions. The battles were often decided by positioning, numbers, and tactical skill, rather than technological superiority. British tanks also had to stop to fire accurately. Both sides operated under the same constraints. The playing field was level in that respect. When Italian forces retreated from Libya into Tunisia in late 1942 and early 1943, they found themselves facing a new opponent. American forces had landed in Morocco and Algeria in November 1942 as part of Operation Torch. By February 1943, American units were pushing eastward into Tunisia, where they would encounter both German and Italian forces defending the shrinking Axis bridgehead. The Americans brought new equipment. Their M3 Grant and M4 Sherman medium tanks mounted 75mm guns in the hull and turret, respectively. These were more powerful than the Italian 47mm guns. American armor was generally thicker. The Sherman had 51mm of frontal armor angled at 56 degrees, providing effective protection equivalent to approximately 75mm against anti-tank projectiles. American tanks had radios in every vehicle, allowing coordinated operations. They had better optics, more ammunition, more fuel capacity, and more powerful engines. Italian intelligence officers compiled reports on American equipment based on captured vehicles and battlefield observations. The reports were distributed to tank units in late January and early February 1943. The assessments noted that American tanks were well equipped and well made. They had superior armor and firepower compared to Italian tanks. Italian crews were advised to engage from longer ranges when possible, to use terrain for protection, and to coordinate with German units who had heavier weapons. What the intelligence reports did not mention, because Italian intelligence officers did not know, was that American Sherman tanks possessed a technological capability that would revolutionize tank warfare. The Sherman's 75mm gun was stabilized in the vertical axis. A gyroscope detected vertical movement of the gun. A hydraulic system automatically adjusted the gun elevation to compensate. The system was not perfect. It could not completely eliminate movement, but it reduced gun movement enough to allow reasonably accurate fire while the tank was moving at speed. This capability was revolutionary. For the first time in armored warfare, a tank could engage targets effectively without stopping. American tankers could fire on the move, hitting targets at combat ranges while traveling at 20 to 25 miles per hour. The psychological and tactical implications were enormous. American tanks could advance while shooting. They could suppress enemy positions while closing the distance. They could engage multiple targets in quick succession without pausing between engagements. They maintained momentum and initiative. The technology behind this capability had been developed over several years. American ordnance engineers had experimented with gun stabilization since the mid-1930s. The Westinghouse Corporation designed the Gyrostabilizer system used in the Sherman. The Mark IV Series 8 Gyrostabilizer consisted of a gyroscope mounted on the gun, a hydraulic power system driven by the tank's engine, and a control system that connected the gyroscope to the hydraulic elevating mechanism. The gyroscope was a precision instrument, a spinning mass mounted in gimbals that maintained its orientation regardless of vehicle movement. When the tank pitched forward, the gyroscope detected the change and sent electrical signals to the hydraulic system. The hydraulic system then adjusted the gun elevation to compensate, keeping the gun pointed at the target despite the tank's movement. The system operated continuously, making thousands of tiny adjustments per minute. The stabilizer had limitations. It only worked in the vertical axis. The turret still had to be traversed manually or with power traverse to track targets horizontally. The stabilization was not perfect. At speeds above 15 miles per hour on rough terrain, the system struggled to fully compensate for violent pitching, but it was enormously better than having no stabilization at all. Tests at Aberdeen Proving Ground had demonstrated that Sherman tanks could hit man-sized targets at 1,000 yards while moving at 15 miles per hour. Hit probability dropped at higher speeds and longer ranges, but it remained far better than unstabilized tanks could achieve. American tank crews trained extensively with the stabilizer system. At Fort Knox, Kentucky, and at other training bases, crews practiced firing on the move. Gunners learned to trust the stabilizer, to keep the crosshairs on target while the tank bounded over rough ground. Loaders learned to work in a moving vehicle, extracting rounds from racks and loading them into the breech while the tank pitched and rolled. Commanders learned to direct fire while moving, taking advantage of the capability to engage targets without stopping. The training emphasized aggressive tactics. American doctrine called for movement and firepower. Tanks would advance rapidly, engaging targets as they appeared. They would not stop unless absolutely necessary. The stabilizer made this possible. It transformed the tank from a mobile gun platform that had to halt to fire into a true fighting vehicle that could shoot while maneuvering. Italian tank crews had no knowledge of this capability. Their intelligence briefs mentioned American tanks had good optics and fire control equipment. Nothing in the reports suggested American tanks could fire accurately while moving. The concept seemed impossible. Every tanker knew you had to stop to aim properly. That was fundamental. It was like saying you could fly without wings or sail without wind. Some things were simply impossible, constrained by the laws of physics and the limitations of mechanical systems. On the morning of February 14, 1943, Capitano Rosselli and his tank company prepared for their role in the German offensive against American positions at Sidi Bou Zid. The plan was straightforward. German panzer units would attack from the north. Italian armor would attack from the east. American forces, caught between the two armored thrusts, would be destroyed or forced to retreat. The Italian tanks moved into position before dawn, their diesel engines clattering in the cold morning air. Rosselli's company had 11 MPH over 40 tanks operational. 3 were down for mechanical repairs. The operational tanks formed up in a loose line, maintaining intervals of approximately 50 meters between vehicles. Radio communication was limited. Only Rosselli's tank and 2 others had functioning radios. The other crews would follow visual signals, watching for hand gestures and flag signals from their commanders. At 06:30 hours, the attack began. German tanks struck American positions from the north. Artillery fire crashed down on American defensive positions. The Italian tanks began their advance from the east, moving across, open ground toward the valley where American forces had established their positions. The M13 over 40 tanks moved slowly, engines straining, tracks throwing dust. Maximum speed was 32 kilometers per hour on roads, but cross-country in loose sand and scrub, they averaged perhaps 15 kilometers per hour. Rosselli scanned the terrain ahead through his binoculars. He could see American vehicles, half-tracks, and trucks primarily. Then he spotted them. Tanks. The distinctive profile of M4 Sherman medium tanks, turrets traversing as they positioned themselves to meet the Italian advance. He counted 6 Shermans, perhaps more beyond them, partially concealed by terrain. The range was approximately 1,200 meters, too far for effective fire from the 47mm gun. Rosselli ordered his company to continue advancing. Italian doctrine called for closing to 500 to 600 meters before engaging, the range where the 47mm gun was most effective. The Shermans were moving, not retreating, but repositioning, taking up, firing positions. Rosselli expected them to stop and prepare to fire. That was what tanks did. You found a good position, you stopped, you engaged the enemy. He was preparing to give the order to halt and form a firing line when something happened that he did not understand. The American tanks were still moving. They had not stopped. Their turrets were traversing, tracking the Italian advance. And then they fired. At 1,000 meters range, while moving at what appeared to be full speed, the American tanks opened fire. Rosselli saw muzzle flashes from the Sherman's 75mm guns. He heard the distinctive crack of high-velocity rounds passing nearby. One round struck the ground 30 meters in front of his tank, throwing up a geyser of sand and rock. His first thought was that the Americans were wasting ammunition. Shooting while moving was pointless. The rounds would go wild. It was desperation fire, the kind of panicked shooting that inexperienced crews did when they were scared. He almost felt contempt. These Americans did not know how to fight properly. Then, the tank to his left, commanded by Tenente Marchetti, exploded. The Sherman's 75mm round struck the M13, 40 inches the frontal hull, penetrated the 25mm armour, and detonated inside the crew compartment. The tank erupted in flames. Smoke poured from the hatches. No one got out. Rosselli stared in disbelief. The Americans were still moving. They had not stopped. Yet they had just scored a direct hit at over 900 meters. This made no sense. It violated everything he knew about tank gunnery. Another round struck the M13 over 40, commanded by Sergeante Ferrara on the right flank. The tank shuddered and stopped, smoke pouring from the engine compartment. The crew bailed out, running for cover in a drainage ditch. The American tanks continued advancing and firing. They were shooting while moving at speeds Rosselli estimated at 25 to 30 kilometers per hour, and they were hitting targets. Not every shot, but enough. A third Italian tank took a hit in the turret. The 75mm round punched through the 30mm armour and killed the commander and gunner instantly. The surviving crew members abandoned the vehicle. Rosselli's mind raced to make sense of what he was seeing. The Americans were firing accurately while moving. This should not be possible. His own tank could not do it. German tanks could not do it. British tanks could not do it. Yet the Americans were doing it. He was watching it happen. His company was being destroyed by tanks that were shooting effectively while moving at full speed across rough terrain. He gave the order to halt and return fire. The Italian tanks stopped, formed a firing line, and began engaging the Shermans. The 47mm guns barked, sending armour-piercing rounds downrange. At 800 meters, the Italian guns could penetrate Sherman armour if they hit at the right angle on the side or rear. The problem was hitting them. The Shermans did not stop. They kept moving, making themselves difficult targets. Rosselli's gunner fired 3 rounds at one Sherman. The first fell short. The second hit the ground in front of the target. The third struck the Sherman's frontal armour at an angle and ricocheted off, the round deflecting upward without penetrating. The Sherman fired back, still moving. The round hit Rosselli's tank in the turret, right at the gun mantlet. The impact was tremendous. The entire tank rang like a bell. The 75mm round penetrated the 30mm turret armour and struck the breech of the 47mm gun, destroying it. Shrapnel killed the gunner instantly. Rosselli felt something hot slash across his face. Blood poured from a wound above his left eye. The tank was dead. The main gun was destroyed. The gunner was dead. Rosselli made the decision instantly. Bail out. He screamed at the driver and hull gunner to evacuate. The crew scrambled from the tank, falling to the ground and running for the nearest cover, a shallow wadi 50 meters away. Behind them, their M13 over 40 sat smoking, disabled, but not burning. From his position in the wadi, Rosselli watched the rest of the engagement. His company's attack had collapsed completely. Of the 11 tanks that had begun the advance, 7 were destroyed or disabled. The remaining 4 were retreating, moving as fast as their engines could push them, trying to escape back to the ridgeline. The Shermans pursued for a short distance, firing as they moved, then halted to form a defensive line. The American tanks had won decisively, destroying an entire Italian tank company in less than 15 minutes of combat. That evening, back at the division command post, Rosselli reported to his battalion commander. He explained what he had seen. The American tanks had fired accurately while moving. They had engaged effectively at ranges beyond 800 meters while traveling at high speed. They had destroyed Italian tanks without stopping to aim. The battalion commander listened with a grim expression. Other units had reported similar experiences. German tank commanders had also noted that American Shermans could fire while moving, though German guns were powerful enough that it mattered less. For Italian tanks with their lighter guns and thinner armour, the American capability was devastating. Over the following weeks, as the Tunisian campaign continued, Italian tank crews encountered American Shermans repeatedly. The pattern was always the same. American tanks would advance while firing. Italian tanks would halt to engage. The Americans maintained momentum and initiative. The Italians were forced into defensive positions, trying to achieve hits on moving targets while remaining stationary and vulnerable themselves. Captured American equipment provided the answer to the mystery. In late March 1943, Italian mechanics examined a damaged Sherman that had been abandoned by its crew after a mechanical breakdown. The tank was largely intact. Italian engineers crawled inside, studying the gun mounting, the fire control systems, the turret arrangement. They found the Gyrostabilizer. They photographed it. They wrote detailed reports describing how it worked, or how they believed it worked based on examination. The reports were distributed to higher command. Technical intelligence summaries explained the American technological advantage. The Sherman possessed a gyroscopic stabilization system that compensated for vertical gun movement. This allowed the tank to fire with reasonable accuracy while moving. The system was complex, requiring precision manufacturing and sophisticated hydraulic systems. It represented a level of technological sophistication that Italian industry could not replicate, at least not in any time frame relevant to the current war. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Italian tank designers reviewed the reports with frustration. They understood the principle. Gyroscopic stabilization was not theoretical physics. It was applied engineering. The problem was implementation. Building a functioning stabilizer required precision gyroscopes, hydraulic pumps and valves, control systems, and integration with the gun mount and fire control system. It required manufacturing capabilities that Italy simply did not possess in sufficient quantity. Italian industry in 1943 was strained beyond its capacity. Factories were working around the clock to produce basic equipment, ammunition, spare parts, and vehicles. Resources were limited. Aluminum, copper, precision steel alloys. These materials were increasingly scarce. Skilled workers had been drafted into the military. Bombing raids by Allied aircraft were disrupting production. The idea of developing and manufacturing an entirely new system as complex as a gun stabilizer was impossible given the circumstances. Even if Italy could have developed a stabilizer, retrofitting it to existing tanks would have required pulling vehicles from frontline service, disassembling the turrets, installing new equipment, testing and calibrating the systems, and then returning the tanks to service. This would have taken months per vehicle. There was neither the time, the facilities, nor the resources to undertake such a program. The solution, such as it was, came in the form of tactical adjustments. Italian tank units received new guidance on engaging American armor. Avoid open ground where American tanks could maneuver freely while firing. Use terrain to limit American mobility, forcing them to slow down or stop. Engage from concealed positions at the shortest possible range, where even moving tanks would have difficulty scoring hits before Italian tanks could fire first. Coordinate with German units equipped with heavier guns that could penetrate Sherman armor at longer ranges. Avoid tank versus tank engagements when possible, using tanks primarily for infantry support rather than armor combat. These tactical adjustments acknowledged reality. Italian tanks could not compete with American Shermans in mobile engagements. The Americans possessed a technological advantage that fundamentally altered the dynamics of armored combat. Italian crews had to accept their limitations and fight accordingly, using whatever advantages they could find in terrain, positioning, and combined arms coordination. For Italian tankers, the realization was bitter. They had trained for years. They had gained combat experience in Libya. They understood their equipment and its capabilities. They were competent, professional soldiers. None of that mattered when facing an enemy with a technological capability that negated their training and tactics. The Americans could shoot while moving. Italians could not. That single difference was often decisive in determining who lived and who died. Rosselli survived the war. After recovering from his wounds, he was assigned to a training unit in northern Italy. Spent the last 2 years of the war teaching new tank crews, many of them teenagers with minimal education, how to operate M13 over 40 tanks and the slightly improved M14 over 41 and M15 over 42 variants that followed. He taught them the same procedures he had learned. Stop, aim, fire. He knew it was obsolete. He knew that American and German tanks had better systems, but it was all Italy had, so he taught it. After the war ended, Rosselli returned to civilian life. He rarely spoke about his experiences. When he did, when former comrades gathered and shared stories, the conversation inevitably turned to equipment. Italian soldiers had fought bravely, they agreed, but they had been asked to fight with inadequate equipment against enemies who possessed overwhelming material advantages. The Americans could fire while moving. This simple fact had led to the destruction of hundreds of Italian tanks and the deaths of thousands of Italian tankers. The gyrostabilizer in the Sherman was not the only technological advantage the Americans possessed. They had better armor, more powerful engines, superior optics, more reliable radios, greater ammunition capacity, and logistics systems that ensured spare parts and fuel reached frontline units consistently. But the stabilizer was symbolic. It represented the kind of sophisticated engineering that came from an advanced industrial economy with vast resources and manufacturing capability. American factories produced 49,234 Sherman tanks during the war. These tanks were built at facilities across the United States. The Detroit Tank Arsenal, built specifically for tank production, employed over 5,000 workers at its peak. The facility covered 1.5 million square feet. Assembly lines ran 24 hours per day. At maximum production, the arsenal produced 97 Sherman tanks in a single month. That was more than Italian factories produced in an entire year. Fisher Tank Arsenal in Grand Blanc, Michigan, built over 11,000 Shermans. Pacific Car and Foundry in Washington State, Baldwin Locomotive Works in Philadelphia, Federal Machine and Welder in Ohio, all contributed to Sherman production. 10 major manufacturers, plus hundreds of subcontractors producing components. The industrial mobilization was unprecedented. Italy produced approximately 2,400 M13 over 40, M14 over 41, and M15 over 42 medium tanks, combined during the entire war. These were built at Fiat Ansaldo facilities in Turin, Genoa, and Milan. Production was limited by shortages of steel, aluminum, and other materials. It was disrupted by Allied bombing raids. It was hampered by lack of machine tools and skilled workers. Italian industry did the best it could with available resources, but the gap between what was needed and what could be produced was enormous. The numerical disparity was matched by qualitative differences. Sherman tanks weighed 30 tons compared to 14 tons for the M13 over 40. Shermans had 51 millimeters of frontal armor angled for maximum effectiveness, compared to 25 to 30 millimeters. On Italian tanks, Shermans mounted 75 millimeters guns with gyrostabilization, compared to 47 millimeters guns without stabilization on Italian tanks. Shermans had 5-man crews with specialized roles, compared to 4-man crews where the commander had to also act as gunner on Italian tanks. Shermans had radios in every vehicle, compared to 1 radio per 3 vehicles in Italian units. Every aspect of design, from ammunition storage to crew comfort to fire control equipment, was better on the American tank. But the stabilizer was the difference that Italian tankers remembered most clearly, because it was the difference they experienced directly in combat. They would stop to aim, following their training and doctrine. The Americans would keep moving while firing. The Americans would hit them. They would try to hit back, aiming at a moving target, and usually miss. Then they would die when the next American round struck their tank. The experience of Italian tank crews in North Africa, particularly in Tunisia, from February to May 1943, was one of gradual, grinding attrition. Unit after unit was thrown into combat against American and British forces. Unit after unit was destroyed. The Centauro Division, the Ariete Division, the Littorio Division, all the Italian armoured formations in North Africa were ground down through constant combat. By May 13, 1943, when the last Axis forces in North Africa surrendered, Italian armoured forces had effectively ceased to exist as a combat capability. Approximately 230,000 Axis soldiers surrendered in Tunisia, including tens of thousands of Italians. Among them were the survivors of the tank battalions, men who had watched their equipment fail them, who had seen their comrades burn in tanks that could not protect them, who had fought bravely and skillfully only to be overwhelmed by enemies with better equipment in greater quantities. The lessons learned from the North African campaign were studied extensively by military analysts after the war. American armor officers examined the effectiveness of the Sherman's stabilizer system in combat. Reports from Tunisia confirmed that stabilized fire provided significant tactical advantages. Shermans could engage effectively while moving at speeds up to 15 miles per hour on moderately rough terrain and up to 20 to 25 miles per hour on smooth ground. Hit probability while moving was not as high as when stationary, but it was far better than unstabilized guns could achieve. The data showed that Shermans firing while moving at 15 miles per hour had approximately 30 to 40% hit probability at 1,000 yards against stationary targets the size of enemy tanks. This dropped to 15 to 20% at 20 miles per hour, and to 10 to 15% at higher speeds. For comparison, tanks without stabilization had essentially zero probability of hitting targets at those ranges while moving. Even a 15% hit probability was enormously better than zero. It meant that a platoon of 4 Shermans firing while advancing would likely score at least 1 hit per volley. That was often enough to suppress enemy positions or destroy enemy tanks before they could respond effectively. Italian after-action reports, captured by Allied forces and analysed post-war, confirmed the American advantage from the receiving end. Italian tank commanders reported that American tanks engaged effectively while moving. Italian crews found themselves unable to track and hit moving targets with their hand-cranked turrets and unstabilized guns. The reports recommended avoiding open terrain where Americans could exploit their mobility, but acknowledged that this was not always tactically feasible. The stabilizer system in the Sherman influenced post-war tank design globally. After World War II, every major military recognized that gun stabilization was essential for modern armored vehicles. Soviet designers developed stabilization systems for the T-54 and subsequent tanks. British engineers improved stabilization technology for the Centurion and Chieftain tanks. American designers refined stabilization for the M46, M47, M48, and eventually the M60 tanks. By the 1960s, all modern tanks had fully stabilized guns in both elevation and traverse, allowing accurate fire while moving at high speed across rough terrain. The evolution continued through subsequent decades. Modern main battle tanks like the M1 Abrams, introduced in 1980, feature sophisticated fire control systems with laser rangefinders, ballistic computers, and advanced stabilization that allows first-round hits on moving targets at ranges exceeding 2,000 meters while the firing tank is moving at 40 miles per hour. The technology that seemed revolutionary in 1943 had become standard and had been refined to levels that would have seemed impossible to World War II tankers. But in 1943, the Sherman's Gyrostabilizer represented cutting-edge military technology. It gave American tankers a significant advantage over enemies who lacked equivalent systems. For Italian tank crews facing Shermans in Tunisia, the advantage was devastating. They were fighting with equipment designed in the late 1930s, equipped with technology from that era, against an enemy who had developed and fielded new capabilities that transformed the nature of armored combat. The story of Capitano Rosselli and his company's destruction on February 14, 1943, was replayed hundreds of times across North Africa, with different names, different units, but the same outcome. Italian tanks would engage American Shermans. The Italians would follow their doctrine, stopping to fire. The Americans would continue moving while shooting. The Americans would win. Italian casualties mounted. Equipment losses were unsustainable. The technological gap proved unbridgeable under combat conditions. For the individual Italian tankers, the experience was psychologically traumatic. They had believed in their equipment. They had trained extensively. They considered themselves competent professionals. Combat revealed that none of that mattered when the enemy possessed fundamental technological advantages. The realization that their tanks were obsolete, that their tactics were inadequate, and that they were being sent into battle with equipment that could not compete with American technology was devastating to morale and unit cohesion. Some Italian tank crews refused to enter combat after witnessing the destruction of other units. Unit commanders reported problems with morale and discipline as soldiers recognized the futility of fighting with inadequate equipment. These were not cowards. These were experienced soldiers who had fought for years in North Africa. They understood that fighting with obsolete tanks against technologically superior opponents was not bravery, it was suicide. When the difference between living and dying came, down to which side had gyrostabilized guns, and when only one side had them, the outcome was predetermined. German tank units in Tunisia faced similar American advantages, but German guns were powerful enough that they could still engage Shermans effectively when they achieved hits. The German 75mm KK 40 litres, 43 gun on the Panzer IV, and the 88mm KK 36 litres, 56 gun on the Tiger, could penetrate Sherman armour at ranges where the Sherman struggled to damage German tanks. German tanks also had better armour protection. This partially compensated for the lack of gun stabilization. German crews could trade shots with Shermans with reasonable confidence that their armour and firepower gave them fighting chances. Italian tanks had neither the armour nor the firepower to compensate for the lack of stabilization. The 47mm gun was adequate against light armour, but struggled against the Sherman's 51mm frontal armour. The M13 over 40's 25 to 30mm armour provided minimal protection against the Sherman's 75mm gun. In a straight fight between M13, 42nds and Shermans, the Americans had every advantage. More armour, bigger gun, better mobility, and the ability to fire accurately while moving. Italian tanks had no advantages to leverage. They simply fought at a severe disadvantage in every category that mattered. The final assessment of Italian armoured forces in World War II, compiled by American military intelligence in 1946, noted that Italian tank crews fought with courage and determination given the equipment available to them. The M13 over 40 and its variants were adequate tanks for the mid-1930s when they were designed, but by 1943 they were obsolete. Italian industry lacked the capacity to develop and produce more advanced designs in quantities needed for modern warfare. The result was that Italian soldiers were asked to fight battles they could not win with equipment that could not compete against the weapons fielded by their enemies. The specific example of American gun stabilization highlighted a broader truth about industrial warfare. Technological advantages accumulated. An enemy with better guns could be fought by using better tactics or positioning. An enemy with better armor could be countered with more powerful anti-tank weapons. But an enemy with better guns, better armor, better mobility, better radios, better optics, and better fire control systems, all simultaneously, could not be countered with tactics or courage alone. The cumulative effect of multiple technological advantages was overwhelming. Italian tank crews discovered this truth through the brutal clarity of combat in Tunisia. They watched American tanks fire accurately while moving at 25 miles per hour. They tried to respond using their unstabilized 47mm guns. They failed. They died. Their equipment could not do what American equipment could do. No amount of training, skill, or determination could overcome that fundamental disadvantage. The laws of physics and the limitations of their mechanical systems were absolute. You could not will an unstabilized gun to hit a target while your tank was bouncing across rough terrain at 20 miles per hour. It was impossible. The Americans had solved that problem with gyroscopic stabilization. The Italians had not. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.